I think we should be good. Hopefully everyone is seeing those slides. And if that's the only glitch we have for the rest of the day, we'll be in great shape. Before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the art of the scene and why I chose this topic and hopefully what we will accomplish together today. The scene is considered one of the least probably thought about or talked about elements in story writing, and yet it's probably one of the most important. It's the building block of an entire story. It's great if we know where we're going in terms of the plot structure and where we're going to put our important scenes and what those scenes might be. But how do we know what to do when we sit down to start writing? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to take a deep dive into the scene. And then at the end, we're going to put it all together and look at where the important scenes in story should fall, or hopefully will fall when you get ready to put everything together. The other part of the topic is the art. And I think that all of us appreciate the fact that writing is a lot more than just a technical craft. We can learn all the rules, we can learn where to put things and how to put things together, but the story itself is a form of art. And when we think about art, think about all the other forms of art that some of us may be experts at: music, dance, painting, photography. All of those forms of art have certain fundamental elements that you learn at the very beginning. I think when I was 15, I thought it would be cool to play the guitar. So I took my brother's guitar and tried to teach myself. And after trying to learn 3 chords, I realized that guitar playing was not for me. You know, for some people, playing chords, it comes naturally, and from there you move into fingering. Not for me. And I think if you look at painting, you learn about perspective and color and contrast. Same thing for photography, depth of field. All the elements that allow you to use the tools of your craft to create art. And that's kind of how I think about what we're doing today. We're talking about the tools at our disposal to help us create the art that is really the story at the end. So I want to take a deep dive into scene. And this is basically what it looks like. This is going to be our adventure for the day. At the very beginning, we're going to start with a basic plot overview and look at where, in general, a story goes from beginning to end. We're not going to really dwell on plot, but we're going to come back to it. So it's going to be a circular talk today. We're going to start very broad with a plot overview, and then we're going to take a deep dive into scenes. And the scene, even though it's the basic element of story, is incredibly complex. It has lots of different angles and ramifications. And the more we know about it, even if we don't consciously say, okay, this scene is going to be a progression scene, and it's going to be an action scene, and maybe it's my opening scene. In the back of our mind, eventually, as we write and write more and more, those things will become natural to us. But if we don't know about them, we can't think about them. I think that the whole purpose of a master's class is not to make us experts, but to give us ideas, to perhaps give us 1 or 2 things that we think about in our own stories and say, you know what, if I thought about that when I sat down to write a scene, it would make my life easier. And that's really the whole purpose of a class like this, is to make your writing life easier by instilling some of the concepts that undermine the entire process of writing a story, but that you want to become something natural in your mind. Whether you plot your story or whether, like me, you start with an idea and characters and go from there, understanding scenes and how they connect to one another to eventually create story is what you need in order to not get lost in the middle. So that's how we're going to go about it today. And we're going to start, as I said, with a plot overview. The elements of story are generally considered to be the plot, the characters, the setting, the conflict, and the themes. And we can make master's classes out of every single one of these and more. But today, primarily, we're looking at plot, because plot is sort of the master form comprised of all the scenes within it. But you can't talk about any of these elements without talking about the others to a certain extent. So we will be talking a little bit about character. We'll be talking a fair amount about setting, a little bit about conflict and theme, but not quite as much. As many of you know, I often talk about Lord of the Rings because, number one, I really like Lord of the Rings. It's one of the classic epic fantasies. And if you remember, there was one ring to rule them all. And when I think about story, there's basically two truths that connect everything in story. And that's that a story is a series of actions. And for our purposes, those actions are the scenes, which are experienced by a character, which produce a change in the way the character views the world or themselves. Basically, this touches on all the elements of story: the plot, the characters, the character growth, the themes, and obviously the conflict, because if you didn't have conflict, you wouldn't have change. Plot is made accessible to the reader through the structure, or the three acts of the story. And those are the things we're going to talk about today: the scenes, and then ultimately the structure upon which those scenes are basically hung. You can think of the plot, or the plot line in any case, as a skeleton. And the scenes are all of the appendages that without which you wouldn't have a very interesting ending. In the late 1800s, Gustav Freytag described plot as consisting of 5 basic elements: the exposition, the rising action, the climax, and then the falling action / resolution. This doesn't look a lot like a pyramid to me, but Freytag conceived it as a pyramid. You'll see these terms used a lot, and we're going to be talking about this general sort of story arc. But for me, looking at these things, it doesn't tell me a whole lot about what exactly are in these portions of this pyramid. What is rising action? What is a climax? What is the falling action? They're scenes, lots of scenes. So this is a very general look at what a plot structure looks like as conceived by Freytag. Probably 100 years later, Christopher Vogler wrote a book called The Writer's Journey. And he was actually reinterpreting or expanding upon other information, another book written by Joseph Campbell in the 1940s, which looked at the hero's journey. And from that, other people have also sort of conceived of the plot as 3 major acts. You will read about the 3-act plot everywhere. Whenever you look at story structure, you're going to see this. I happen to think that this is one of the easiest way to conceive of how to construct plot. And as we go through and end up today, this is going to be all filled in with various scenes and pointers about what to put where. It's not a formula. You can move things around. You can lengthen the acts, shorten the acts. You can put the scenes in different places depending on what your purpose is. But in general, this is not something that came out of thin air. This came out of actually looking at literally centuries of stories and how they were put together and what made effective storytelling. Even when the stories were oral, they follow the same path. And basically, if you think about Freytag's pyramid, you can see exactly what's happening. This is the expository phase and the rising action, going up to a peak action up here, the climax, and then falling action and resolution. So even though there's 100 years that separates these things, the people who studied them saw exactly the same thing. Now, for some of us, we like cartoons. And I love this one. This is from a blog post by Christina Wodke. This actually has exactly the same shape as Freytag's pyramid, and it follows basically the same pattern of the 3 acts. Down in here, you've got a character who we would call the hero, who starts out somewhere. Something happens to push that person off on a journey. A whole bunch of other stuff happens in here. Something big happens up here. And eventually, the hero figures out what's been going on this whole time, solves the problem, whatever it might be, and the story comes to a happy conclusion, and the hero returns home changed. This is the hero's journey in cartoon form, which I absolutely adore. And if you look at it all together, the pattern persists. This is what we're going to talk about today. a little bit about what scenes go in here, a lot about these. These are scenes. All of these little squiggles are scenes. Up and down, up and down, up and down. And you're going to, I hope, begin to understand the rhythm of how these scenes are put together. But this is the picture to kind of keep in your mind as we go through. And at the end of the talk, we're going to fill this in down here with all the particular scenes that we've talked about. So we're going to start with how to put scenes together, what they are, how they work, how to start them, what to put in them, and how to end them. So some of these things may seem simplistic, and I know that a lot of you are familiar with this, but I think that the more detailed we are, the more likely we are to find that one little detail that maybe you haven't thought about before, or you're going to think about in a different way after hearing this. So a scene is a subset of the plot. It can be of variable length. Now, all of us write differently. For some reason, my natural pattern of scene writing is 2,500 to 3,000 words. When I sit down to write a scene, that's usually how long it is. If for some reason, and those are usually chapters, if I'm going to have a scene break within my chapter, then my scenes are almost always half of that length. We'll talk about when to change scenes and when to break scenes, but we all have our own natural rhythm. But one thing you'll see as your story progresses is that your scenes will get shorter and shorter. As the action rises in your story, as the tension rises in your story, and certainly in the last act of your story, the last 25% or so, your scenes will probably get a lot shorter. The reason is you've already done all of the sort of background work for the story. You've introduced your characters, everyone knows the conflict, all of the sort of tension that you've brought to bear through the entire middle part of the book is coming to fruition. So you're going to be moving a lot faster towards your conclusion. So that's kind of the natural rhythm that most of us will see, but how long your scenes are may be very much up to you. There's no rule for that. There are some rules that will be helpful. People have asked, well, how do I know, like, when should I write a new scene? Generally, a scene takes place in a single setting, meaning a particular time and place, and usually with the same cast of characters. Now, you may introduce a new character into the scene, but if all of a sudden you've got characters who are doing something different, or you want to visit a different group of characters within your story, then you will generally change scenes. So time passing, geographic location, or changing your cast of characters, you're going to change your scene. You'll either break your scene or end your chapter, depending on what you're doing right at that moment, what plot element you're actually talking about. Every scene has a purpose, and I'm sure you've heard this before probably 50 million times, but it can't be said enough. Every scene has to do one of two things, or both. It needs to advance the plot, which means that you're going to introduce in some way more information or new information, or your character is going to look at old information in a new way. That's how you advance plot. Or something that the characters say or do or experience or think is going to show something new about them, or it's going to show a change in them. So when you sit down and you get ready to write, ask yourself, what point am I going to make with what I'm writing today? Do I need to move things along a little bit? Do I need to put a new element in, add a new clue? Do I need to have another zombie attack? Or do I need to show the character reacting to what just happened and perhaps starting to think about things in a different way? So that's what purpose means. We're going to talk about that a lot more in a little bit. Not every scene in the book is a major scene. First of all, you'd be exhausted if you wrote only major scenes for 75,000 words, and your reader would be exhausted if they were reading major scenes. Plus, you need to get people from place to place. You need to take a breath once in a while. So not every scene is major, but every novel will have major scenes, and they're very similar from one genre to the next, and we call those story beats. And we're going to talk about story beats and how, more specifically, you will see particular story beats in romances, in mystery, in sci-fi fantasy, so that even if you're not plotting, if you're a pantser like me, you need to know in the back of your mind what those story beats are. Because if you drop a beat, it's like dropping a beat in a song. You go off track, you lose your place, it doesn't come out right. And sometimes when people say, well, I'm kind of stuck, I don't know what to write next, or I'm in the middle of my book and I don't know where to go. Sometimes it's because there's a major story beat that's missing, or the story beat has been underwritten, or you changed direction and nobody else in the story did. So you frequently need to go back and look at the story beats and say, have I covered everything I needed? Have I built the foundation so that I can keep going? That's how story beats help you when you get stuck. And as I said before, every scene must contribute something. If it's the most wonderful scene in the whole world and you love it and it's funny and it's hot or it's sexy and it doesn't do one of those two things, you're going to end up cutting it, or your editor is going to tell you to cut it. So when you're writing a scene, make sure that it's contributing to your story. So these are the tools we're going to start with. And just like any other art form, we all have tools that help us do our work. So we're going to go through the tools that we use to build a scene and talk about how important they are or aren't, or when you need to have more or less of your setting, how dialogue can help you build your scene, what is narration or narrative, and how do we use it so that we're doing that show and don't tell some. Internal narrative, which are the thoughts of the characters. I think this is one of the areas that it perhaps is, I see that is most underwritten. If you're coming up short in your word count and your book seems to be like running away with the action, but it doesn't seem to have a lot of depth, it's usually because the internal narrative is missing. We don't have a sense of the characters' internal lives. So internal narrative is a very important tool. Point of view, obviously, is the sort of window into the thoughts and emotions of our characters. And as I said, you can't talk about any of these things without talking about all of them. So character is obviously important, and point of view is critical to constructing character. Pace. Talked a little bit about scene length. Scenes are going to be a little bit longer, probably a little bit more descriptive earlier on in your book, and then they're going to get shorter. And the length of scenes is one way that you control pace. How you write the scenes is another way to control pace. Are your sentences long and very descriptive, or are they short and very fast-paced action sentences? And again, when we talk about action scenes, we'll talk about that. And finally, style. Style is how you write. How do you use language? How do you construct sentences? Do you do it the same for every book, or do you do it the same in every scene? And I suspect the answer is no. Again, when you're writing description, when you're writing setting, your sentences will probably be longer. They may or may not be very figurative, meaning using descriptors that compare things like black as midnight, or in the metaphor, hope was a fragile seed. It depends really on what kind of mood you're creating. If it's a quiet time and the character is contemplative, then the language may be a little more figurative. In the middle of an action scene, in all likelihood, you're going to be using action verbs, very short sentences, not a lot of figurative language. Nobody's going to stop and think about things. So your figurative language, or your use of language in general, is going to depend, again, on what kind of scene you're writing. What are you trying to create? Are you trying to create mood? Are you trying to create a seduction scene? Are you trying to show action? That's going to determine how you write. And hopefully you don't write every sentence in every scene the same. And it's something to think about as you start integrating these tools with the particular function of the scene that you're writing. So we're going to start with setting. Every single scene has to have some element of setting. even if it's a sentence. Now, the earlier in the book, or every time you introduce a new setting, it's going to probably be a little bit more elaborate. But every scene, the reader needs to know where they are in time, place, and generally, is it day or night? Is it raining? Whatever. But a scene without a setting is very confusing for a reader. Within the setting, again, earlier in the book, there'll be more information when you create setting. Later in the book, probably less, but setting allows you to create context for your character, depending on where they are. Does the book start out in a quiet country church? Does it start out in the middle of a metropolitan area? Does it start out on an asteroid? Whatever your initial setting is, and this is going to be more important in the opening scenes of your book than later on, you may or may not need this context, but at a minimum, every single scene needs to orient the reader very quickly in time, place, and environment, and point of view, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The setting also allows you to create mood. If it's raining, if the character's reacting to what's going on outside, if it's sundown and someone is sitting and watching the sky change color, you may get a sense of mood that reflects the character's sense of mood. So use the setting to help reflect character. It can reflect many things about what the character's experiencing. And so again, setting appears in the background, but it's actually an important tool. So it's something that I think a lot of us skip over. I'm not great at setting. I always want to get on to the good stuff, and I kind of forget that setting is important, and I have to make myself slow down, especially early on when I'm introducing new locations or a character in a new place. It's something that if you don't do enough of, or you don't do well, or you forget about, it's something to remind yourself. Dialogue. Again, this is one of the key elements of writing. And within a scene, it's a great tool to help us reveal plot in particular. If two characters are talking, if they're recapping something that's happened, it enables you to use that dialogue to interject new plot elements or to review plot elements that have happened before. You see this a lot in mysteries, where there are a lot of confusing clues or a lot of information that the character needs to kind of remind the reader of. You'll see dialogue used. I would suggest not to use dialogue to what we call info dump, which is basically not to use dialogue filled with lots of jargon or scientific information, or just about, or historical reviews, because first of all, it never sounds natural. It becomes very apparent that you're info dumping. So when someone says, oh, really? Well, tell me about asteroids, and suddenly you get a lecture on astrophysics, it's very apparent. So whatever information you want to impart in dialogue, try to keep it as natural and minimal as possible. Just imagine if you were sitting with someone who started to give you a lecture, you'd be pretty bored. So yes, it can reveal plot, but don't use it as an info dump. Use it more to show what the character is thinking or how they react to elements. If you're good at humor, injecting humor is always helpful. It helps us develop character. It is definitely a good place to foreshadow upcoming events. If you're writing a mystery or romantic intrigue and you have your character talking with another character, they can certainly say, well, you know, we really need to find out X. And that will allow you to move your plot into the next scene and to introduce a new element. Dialogue also controls pace, and it's really important to remember that. If you look at your writing on the page, look at what we call white space. White space is all the blanks where there aren't any words. And if there isn't any white space, what that basically means is you are writing paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of exposition, which slows the pace, tends to tire the reader, and probably means you're skipping some important elements like character interaction in particular, because when characters interact, they talk. And that's the point of white space. Whenever you interject dialogue, you're going to have more white space. If you look at your page and it's all white because it's all dialogue, then you're missing the other elements and the writing is unbalanced. So it's a really good test. When I get a manuscript to review and I open it up in the first 5 pages, there's no white space. I'm expecting probably something, either a big info dump of background or a lot of internal narrative where the character is doing a lot of internal thought and probably navel gazing, which is not a great way to start a book. So you can check yourself and just scan the last few pages of what you've written. And if there's lots and lots of dialogue and not much else, go back, slow down, and ask yourself, what are the characters thinking? How are they feeling about what just happened? And interject a little bit of internal thought or description or anything else that helps to fill that out a little bit. Which brings us to narrative. Your narrative is anything that isn't dialogue. And that is actually a lot more complicated than you might imagine. In its simplest form, narrative is description. It tells the reader something. It describes something. The setting, obviously, we've just talked about that. There may be information relayed in the narrative, describing the surroundings, notes passage of time, shows the character moving from place to place, or introduces a new setting. It may be used to relate or review past events, especially if, and these are the last 2 things that we don't think about when we think about narrative, and that's that narrative can also relay the thoughts and feelings of your character. And for me, other than setting up some of the basics for the scene, that's the most important thing. That's what we use narrative for, is to show the reader what's going on inside the character by relaying their internal thoughts and their internal feelings. And those thoughts and feelings can basically do a lot of the other things on this list in terms of especially relating or reviewing past events. If someone has just had their first kiss, then they're darn for sure going to be thinking about it afterwards, and they're going to have feelings about it. And narrative is how we describe those things. So narrative is not sort of dry and only relegated to summarizing events. It's a very kind of vital part of character construction and moving plot forward. Point of view, we talked about. At the beginning of every scene, and we're going to demonstrate this a little bit later, you need to make very clear whose point of view you're in. If you have more than one character that you're writing their point of view. If you are writing in first person, then it's first person. And you don't have to think about it because it's always going to be that one character is going to be the only character in the story with a point of view. If you're writing third person and you're writing what we call third person limited, that means only one character has a point of view for the entire story. So once again, you don't have to think about point of view because they're the only character with a point of view. Most of us will write more than one character with a point of view. Well, maybe not most. I do. Certainly most romance writers, but not everyone, will give the 2 main characters a point of view. Sometimes if you have an ensemble cast where you've got 3 or 4 characters who perhaps share the stage, or in the book I just wrote last fall, Cost of Honor, I've got one group of characters in Washington, D.C., and another group of characters in Philadelphia. And so I have multiple characters with points of view. So you're going to want to make sure that the reader understands whose point of view am I in this scene very early on. Then what we would like to do is go deeper into that character's point of view, and that's called deep point of view. Deep point of view basically reveals the psychological and that's not spelled right, my apologies, psychological and emotional point of view of the character. And we do that by basically using narrative, but using the narrative as if we were looking from inside the character's body out through their eyes and sensing and feeling and observing the environment through all of their senses. And I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. And I know that, again, this is an entire workshop worth of work right here, but I'm just trying to point out to you the things that you should be thinking about during scene construction. And that is getting deep into your character as they experience whatever events you want to write about in that scene. Remember that when you're in a character's point of view, and this doesn't have anything to do with deep point of view per se, but whenever you are writing in a particular character's point of view, they can't describe themselves, which means that they won't comment about their eye color or their facial expressions or what they're wearing usually. I mean, you might think of it this way. If you would think about it in relative to yourself, you can express it. But you probably never think, I just raised my eyebrows, or my blue eyes are shining. And if you wouldn't think that about yourself, your character won't think it either. So that's one of the easy ways to tell if you're sliding out a point of view, is if they begin describing themselves. Generally, when you are writing deep point of view, you are not writing the character thought or the character felt or the character saw or the character heard, because you're in their point of view, so they are experiencing it. So you're going to show what it was that they saw or what they heard or what they wondered without actually using those words. This allows you to basically show the reader what the character is experiencing as opposed to telling. And a really good example is where it says, describe, don't label. Instead of saying the character, Jane was angry, you would describe how Jane feels when she's angry. You would say something like, her chest tightened, and whatever else one feels when one is angry. A surge of heat rose in her throat. Some description of her feelings when she's angry or hurt or aroused. That requires a lot more work than just saying she was turned on, for example. But it creates a much more authentic character, and it gives your reader a chance to experience what your character is experiencing. And that's really what you want. Deep point of view will also generally encompasses everything that the character experiences in their environment, what they see, what they feel, and what they think. And I have a little bit of an example here, a comparative example, to try to give you basically a look at how you would write in a very summarizing, expository way, and then how you would write in deep point of view. In third person, Ari is the character. All right, so this is third person, and it's perfectly legitimate, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with this sentence. Ari was so aroused, thinking about how hot Gabriella looked in leather, she couldn't sleep. There's nothing wrong with that. It tells the reader that whatever last time Ari saw Gabriella, she was wearing leather and she was hot. And she's been thinking about it and she can't sleep. But if you were to write this in Ari's point of view, but in deep point of view, what you would try to do is give her experience of going through all of this. What you just told the readers she was experiencing, you would try to show the readers. Ari closed her eyes again, and Gabriella stepped into view, strutting down the runway, the tiny leather briefs barely covering anything. The ache between Ari's legs pulsating, begging for one little touch. Pathetic, humiliating. No wonder she couldn't sleep. So hopefully you will see the difference in that in the second example, we're experiencing as Ari experiences trying to go to sleep and then being disturbed by this erotic image of this woman that she's lusting after. That's the difference, I think, between creating emotion for your reader and basically telling the reader what's going on, but not really getting kind of inside to the emotions. It takes practice. It takes a fair amount of practice, but first of all, it takes thinking about it. So every time you describe something, every time you write was angry, was hurt, was excited, think about how you can write that in a different way. We talked a little bit about pace before. Pace is the speed at which events occur, which basically means the speed at which you go from one scene to another and how quickly your plot progresses. Pace is a balance between narration, dialogue, and what you're actually writing about. And remember I mentioned white space? The more white space you have, the faster things go, which means if you're in the later part of your book and you're not describing things in great detail because we already know, if you're not spending a lot of time talking about internal feelings or thoughts because too much is going on for anybody to stop and think, you're going to have more white space, more dialogue probably, shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs, less description, more action words, less internal reflection. You're going to go faster. A lot of times I will comment on manuscripts where the pace gets very slow in the middle half of the book. Between 25% of your book and 75% of your book is where all the good stuff is supposed to happen. And we'll talk about what that good stuff is, but basically that's where you build everything that leads to a believable ending. And what you don't want are long, flat scenes where nothing much happens, which basically means you're writing scenes that aren't creating tension, that aren't exposing something new about the character, that aren't exciting from, if it's a mystery or an intrigue or a space opera, there's not enough action. And you're probably writing too much narrative. So when it looks like your pace is really slowing down and your story is kind of plodding along, it probably means that your scenes are repetitive and you're not introducing enough new information and you're not introducing enough conflict and action. Okay, now we've kind of talked about the tools, and I'm probably pretty sure that most of you are familiar with all of them, but I wanted to kind of put into context how we think about them when we start writing scenes, because now we're going to start writing scenes. And we're going to start by talking about what the scene is supposed to do, and that would be the function of the scene, how we put it together, whether a scene is an action scene or a reaction scene. We'll move on to the particular scenes within stories and then talk a little bit about putting together these specific scenes before we get to putting them all together into a story. Now, there's going to be a lot of kind of descriptions in this section. And again, it's not something you need to like memorize right at this moment. What I want to do is give you a sense of the versatility of scenes, of what they actually do for you and how you can use them, and the fact that you're probably writing them already and don't even realize it. You know, some authors who write very instinctively will say, well, why do I need to know all this stuff if I just do it anyways? And the answer is, well, you don't, because maybe you're one of those people who are blessed and you were just born being able to write a great story, just, you know, like some people can play the piano when they're 3 or, you know, be a tennis pro when they're 7. I'm not one of those people, and most of us aren't. And the more we understand about what goes into making a story, even if we're not consciously writing notes about every single scene that we write, the more instinctively we will begin to use it as time goes on. So that's why we're going to go through all the various permutation of scenes, because they're incredibly complicated, and yet we don't think about them very much. So there are two scenes that do two different things. We have transition scenes, and we always have them. And I always, when somebody says, well, how was your writing day? And I'll go, oh, you know, I was writing a transition scene, so it's kind of boring. Because transition scenes are really critical. They get us from one place to the next. So it may be a change in location. Now, this may be pretty short. They often recount past events. Things have been happening in the story. Characters have been experiencing things. And then the characters get together and they all have to be introduced to what just happened. That's particularly true if you're writing an intrigue, for example, or you're writing a mystery, or characters have experienced something off stage and then they're back on stage with other characters and they need to bring them up to speed. Or we have to move this story along because now we need to introduce a couple new plot elements. And that happens when the villain shows up, for example. Or if we're writing a romantic intrigue or a mystery, more clues appear, or there's a new threat arises. We need to move the plot forward. So it's not one of our major scenes where a big thing happens, but we're setting the stage for the next event. So these tend to be a little bit shorter. They tend to be quieter scenes. There's not a lot of action and tension, but they're necessary because otherwise all we've got is a book with 13 major scenes, which basically is really hard to write, and we're going to have gaps. So that's what a transition scene is. A progression scene is a major scene. It's what we call a story beat, and it's one of the primary plot points that we're going to talk about when we get to the little chart at the end. It has a particular function in the story. It's best not to leave any of them out. And they tend to be big scenes, and they need to be big scenes. This is particularly true if you're writing a romance. If you're writing a story beat and you've underwritten it, and I'll take for an example, the meeting, it's one of the key elements in a romance. And if it's 2 paragraphs long, it's not long enough. These need to be big, strong scenes because they're the scenes that hold the story together, and they're the scenes that readers recognize and look for. Same is true if you're writing a mystery. The introduction of the crime, for example, it can't be little. It can't be a brief paragraph description. It has to have impact. It has to have significance to the reader. It has to be interesting. These are the kind of things that if it isn't, the reader's not going to go along for the ride. Same is true if you're writing sci-fi fantasy. When you first introduce whatever the challenge is to that world, it better be something really interesting. Otherwise, nobody's going to care about what happens at the end. So major story beats are big scenes. Maybe it's an entire chapter. If it's an entire chapter, it's one scene. It may be 2, it may be 2 chapters, it may be 5 scenes, but those beats need to be emphasized. So that's the difference between transition scenes and progression scenes. And probably if you counted the kinds of scenes that you actually wrote, you'd probably have more transition scenes. So how do we put them together? We've talked a little bit about this already. Every scene it's like a mini story, and I'm sure you've heard this before. A beginning, a middle, and an end. Every scene has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in the beginning, as we said already, critical is establishing point of view. Who is in control of this scene? When is it taking place? And where is it taking place? And I know this sounds really basic, but I can't tell you how many manuscripts I read where I'll start a scene and have no idea, whose point of view we're in for 3 or 4 lines. And then you have to go back to the beginning and read it over again. And you do not want that to happen. So somewhere within the first couple of lines, you need to establish this in every scene. Then the middle of the scene, just like in your story, is where the stuff happens. And that stuff, depending on what kind of scene you're writing, is either going to increase the conflict in the story, up the stakes, increase the action, or it's going to be a response to a scene in which you have increased the conflict, enhanced the action, introduced a new threat, and that's what we call reflection. So this is the what happens or why does it happen part. And then every scene ends with either a dilemma for the main character or a decision that the main character has come to. The dilemma can be a cliffhanger. It can be a suggestion for they're going to take a new action, or a question that challenges them. And what that does is it leaves the reader with the thought, well, what's going to happen next? And the reason it's really important is that it tells you how you're going to start your next scene. Because the ending of the last scene and the question, what next, tells you where to go next. And that's so important. I think if you've been away from your book for a while, even a couple of days, you've been to a meeting, or you've been preparing for a meeting, or you're spending time at a virtual meeting and you haven't been writing, and you sit down and you get ready to write and you think, where am I? Go back to your last scene. And at the end of that scene, it will tell you where to go next if it's been properly written, because it ends with either an action that's going to propel the next scene or a decision. But both of those things will impact your character and you'll know where to go next. So I'm going to back up for 1 second. Oops, I guess I'm not. Oh, yes, I am. Here we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about each of these parts in detail, because this is really writing the scene part. And we're going to start with how to start the scene, which is also called the launch. And I'm going to show you some examples. There are 3 different ways to start a scene. And we're going to go through each one with a couple of examples, because I think that sometimes that's better than just a description. And then we'll talk about the middle and the end separately as well. So the first way that you can launch a scene, and this is actually the introduction of one of the very early scenes in this book. It's not the first chapter, but it's in the first couple of chapters. This is from Both Ways by Ileandra Young. You can have a narrative launch, which is narration. Okay, this is a description that sets up the action or reflects on previous events. This one actually sets up action really, really well, because I cut it right where the action starts. But it also is early in the book, and it's really instrumental to world building. So it shows you how scenes can be very versatile and do many things. The goblin opens my door, and I exit the car with my hands thrust into my pockets. Like other buildings in this district, City Hall's exterior is decorated in posters and pennants of blue. From a banner above the entrance, a stern-faced man with frown lines and a crew cut stares down on those who dare enter. Vote Mikkelsen, demands the signage beneath. No thanks. At least the other guy knows how to smile. I hurry up the steps and pull on the doors, wary of the trolls to either side. Either they know to expect me or they're off duty, because neither moves as I slip through. Inside, the foyer is high-ceilinged, echoing space with elegant decor and gleaming marble. The Angbek city crest glitters on the floor, picked out in mosaic tiles of red, green, yellow, and blue. I walk to the reception desk, straight into a woman who promptly drops every folder, poster, and badge she holds. So this is a descriptive opening. It's told in first person, so you don't have to question whose point of view are you in. It has taken us clearly to a new location. And this is early in the story, so you're getting a fair amount of description. And that makes sense because we're in a new location, so you're going to want a description. It also tells you a lot about this world, obviously, because there you go. You've got goblins and trolls. There's a really lovely description of this foyer, which is told with fairly figurative language. It gives you a real picture of it. And it's told from deep point of view. You can know right here inside the foyer is a high ceilinged echoing space. This character is seeing this space, and you are seeing what they're seeing. And then at the very end, the action of this scene begins. Perhaps this is the meat. Perhaps this is the villain. But this introduction, called a narrative launch, sets up the action. And from here on out, something's going to happen. So that is one way to start a scene. It's called a narrative launch. This is another way, and I like this one because it's an action launch, but it's not action. There's movement in this scene, but what it is forward momentum for this character. It's also told in deep point of view, this is the opening of this book, If You Dare by Sandy Lowe, which will be out. It's an erotic romance, which will be out in a couple of months. Christmas sucked. The small town of Sunrise Falls sucked, and the blame fell squarely on Santa's jolly shoulders. As far as Lauren West was concerned, Santa could take his holiday cheer and shove it up his red polyester-covered ass. She swung the SUV rental car into the rutted lot of the Grumpy Goat and snagged the last spot. Pulling between a Ford pickup, so rusty the bed looked ready to collapse, and a Subaru Crosstrek in eye-searing orange. Grumpy's was the only bar in town and mercifully open on Christmas Day night. So this opens a book. So it opens the first chapter. It opens the scene, and it's action because you have this character moving through space, but we're also very firmly in this character's point of view. We're seeing her thoughts initially right away, how she perceives what she sees around her. And the other thing that we didn't talk about very much is establishing character, and this obviously does it right away. How she thinks about Christmas, how she thinks about poor Santa Claus and Santa's butt, tells you a lot about this character. The other thing that this gives us right off the bat is author voice, because although the character's voice is not the author's voice and shouldn't be, there's always a connection. And this tells you that there's kind of a sharp sense of underlying humor and a little bit of irony, a little bit of sarcasm, and it sets up an erotic romance particularly well. So this is an action start. We jump into the action. We don't know who this character is other than we get her name, but we know we're going to learn more about it when we step into the bar. So rather than prefacing this by describing who this person is or where they came from or why they were on their way to the bar or why they don't like Christmas, we start right away with character. So this is into the action, elaborate later. The last approach to opening a scene is called the setting launch, which is one that I use a lot. There's a lot of controversy now about opening stories in the middle of action, that the book should not start with setting, that you should jump right into the action and then describe later who they are and what's going on. I find that a little bit disorienting, and I think that a couple of paragraphs of getting the reader comfortable in where they are and who they're with is less disorienting, but I'm not saying it has to be done that way. This is an example of using a setting launch. It works well when a particular place is integral to the event. If your story is going to be an action adventure story and everything is set off by a volcano exploding, you could start the book right in the middle of the volcano exploding, and that would be an action start. You could also start the story with characters approaching an island with a quiescent volcano on a cruise ship. And as they land, all of a sudden the volcano erupts. Or, I think you probably get the idea, you can start things by putting the reader in the environment before the action starts. Sometimes the locale is almost a character. in your work. This is true for me in the Provincetown Tales. It's particularly true for me in the Rivers Community Series, because the infusion of rural sensibility in the Rivers series, of community, of people knowing each other, of people having shared history, is really important to the story and to character development. So for that, locale is really important. The sights and the sounds and the smells that you include in your setting introduction can be very helpful in determining the mood of the story, or can reflect the character's state of mind. So I think there are reasons to use all of these openings. This one is from Mending Fences, which came out in May by Angie Williams. This is the opening of the first chapter. So this is not only the opening of the scene, this is the opening of the book. The dust and heat of the day tested Bobby Del Rey's typically unwavering good humor as she rode the fence line of her family's 400-acre ranch. She'd been responsible for this chore since she was 13 and knew every inch by heart. Bobby regretted the extra hour she'd spent fixing an old tractor that pushed her ride around the property later than she liked. The security and care of her herd had been the lifeblood of her family's livelihood for 3 generations. And now that her father was gone, the responsibility sat squarely on her shoulders. This tells you a lot about character. You know right away who the character is. You know the time of day. You know that she's on her own land. She knows what the land means to her. You know what she feels about her responsibility. And it tells you a little bit, it tells you a lot about character. So within a paragraph, you've gotten a tremendous amount of information. It's a short launch. But this is the kind of setting launch that I think is perfectly effective and reasonable, and a great example of the setting launch. So once you've gotten your launch off the ground, we know who the primary character is, we know where they are, we know what time, place, etc. Then we're ready to get into it. And there are 2 different kinds of scenes. These 2 are really important for you to understand. If you don't kind of get anything new out of this talk, this would be it. There are basically 2 kinds of scenes in terms of what they accomplish. An action scene basically is a scene in which conflict is heightened and the main character is challenged with either something new, or a new threat, a new conflict, a new event. But this is a scene. It doesn't necessarily mean there's a battle or there's a major event in terms of it actually being action. What it means is there's a new introduction of a major plot element, like a challenge to their sense of well-being, or you have introduced in some of your other stories, like a mystery or a romantic intrigue or sci-fi fantasy, you've introduced a new villain, a new threat, or a new challenge. And at the end of the scene, the character is left with this disaster or challenge that they have to face. The reaction scene is a quieter scene. It's often called the sequel. It's often called the reflection. This is how that action scene impacted on your character. They go together. It's a ebb and flow kind of relationship, and it should happen one after another throughout your book. That's the most important thing. When you have an action scene, and we're going to take like the first kiss, okay? That's not a battle, hopefully, but it is a significant scene for the character because that kiss challenges their sense of who they are, of what they want in a relationship, of what they think they don't want, or whatever the case may be. That's a big scene. That is a major scene in a book, in a romance. And when they're done, they're left with this sense of, what have I done? In the reaction scene or the reflection scene, the character will think about or respond to the event that just happened, whatever it was. whether it was a new threat, an assassination attempt, a new monster, a movement forward in intimacy. Now they have to deal with that on an emotional level. And that's what's called the sequel. So you have an action scene and a reaction scene, or some people confusingly call this scene and sequel. And you will see when you're reading books on structure, scene and sequel. I'm not crazy about that because obviously they're both scenes. So I like to think about action scene and either reaction or reflection. And it's a rhythm that persists throughout your story. And I'm going to basically show you some examples of those going forward. But what happens in a reaction scene or the reflection scene is the character reacts to whatever it was. It may be a couple of paragraphs. It may be a short scene. It may only be a few paragraphs at the end of the other scene, of the first scene. They may actually blend together. This is something that I think authors very often overlook. It's particularly critical in a romance, but it's necessary in everything that you write. When characters experience something new, whether it's something that makes them happy or something that frightens them, something that challenges them, the reaction that they have to it is where we see character growth. That's where we see change. They make a decision. The character who's just been kissed says, I'm not going to do that again. That is dangerous. So what do they do about it? They tell the character they don't want to see them anymore. So they come to a decision based upon how they reflected on that event. Or you present your sleuth with a new clue. That's the action scene. Then the sleuth thinks it over and says, okay, well, this is where I need to go next. Or I need to look at so-and-so again. That's the decision that they make. So there's always an interplay between new information, new challenges, more conflict, and reflection, where the character reacts to, incorporates the impact of that action, and makes a decision to go forward or not go forward or change direction. So either of these scenes can be major scenes. If the character changes direction, if the character decides, oh, okay, I'm done with this. I'm not going to do this anymore. It's dangerous. I'm going to get killed. I'm going to get hurt. We're going to lose the battle. In that reaction scene, they've made a major decision that changes the direction of the story. And that makes it a major story beat. So reaction scenes are not throwaway scenes. They can be major scenes. They can be critical scenes if they actually show your character changing, growing, or altering the course of the story. So this is the middle of your scene. This is where all the stuff happens. And then we're going to get to the end. And these are both from mine, it looks like. This is from Love on the Night Shift. And the first is an action scene, and it's not what you would typically think of as an action scene, but it is. This is a scene where one of the main characters has been invited to a big community party. And not to give too much of the story away, let's just say that big parties create a lot of anxiety for this character, and they bring up old fears because something bad happened in her past. Okay, so I'm just going to break in. This is at the very end of this scene. This is the end of the scene. She'd never quite managed to shake the anxiety that surfaced with the onslaught of too many, too loud voices, and the fraying of boundaries that went along with the lowering of inhibitions or plain old carelessness. She took a breath. That wasn't the here and the now. This was the homestead, and these were not strangers. These were friends she could trust, and she was careful, always. With another, easier breath, she plunged into the chaos. So she did something. This is how the scene ends. She's there, she's standing on the doorstep, and she makes a decision that she's going to go forward, and she takes that step. She moves forward, leaving the reader to wonder what's going to happen to her. So that's why this is a action scene because it ends on a little bit of an emotional cliffhanger, and it ends showing her challenged by the circumstances. So that's what we would consider an action scene. Obviously, you can have honest to God action scenes where there's a battle or there's a physical confrontation or there's an assassination attempt, and that's going to end with the question, who got killed or what's next? A reaction scene is a scene that ends with a decision or a new direction. It shows the character being changed or responding to a previous event. And this is obviously a post-first kiss moment in this book. She pushed the glider steadily, back and forth, far from ready to sleep. How many more minutes would she spend reliving the softness of Grady's mouth, the tremor of Grady's muscles beneath her palm, the soft murmur of pleasure that escaped Grady's throat as she'd touched her? More than a minute's in a day, countless. This is a reflection scene because it shows her reliving a moment that up until that time she hadn't thought she wanted. But now she's accepting the fact that this has changed her. She's not going to be able to forget this moment. That's a big step forward for this character in the romance arc. And that's why this is a reflection scene, because it ends in a decision and a new direction. And sometimes the decision, you could substitute the word acceptance. It shows the character reliving or reevaluating what's come before and accepting that something new will be going forward. All right, we're going to move on now to the major scenes in story and talk about, we're going to get to them and we're going to get to the specific scenes in just a minute, but this is a little bit of a recap. But these are what you would expect to see in your major scenes. These are going to be the moments that are pivotal to the plot. They either introduce key elements of the plot or they show a change in the direction for the character. They introduce your thematic elements. They are big scenes. That's what I said before. And big scenes doesn't necessarily mean long scenes, but they have to be filled with significant impact on character or plot. There may be within these scenes a set of little mini climaxes. And as you progress further and further towards the end of the book, the scenes may resolve some issues and then move things forward. If you have two plots going forward, say you've got a major plot and a fairly major subplot, they're probably not going to end at the same time. So as the book progresses, some of those plots may tie up those other stories. This is particularly true in a romantic intrigue, for example. The romance and the intrigue don't culminate at the same place. Your major scenes open your story and set up your main protagonists. They show major conflict. This is where your crisis happens. This is where your characters come to realizations. This is where you pay off the reader being patient the entire time. Basically, your major scenes, without them, the story would fall apart. And without them, your readers would not be very satisfied. And I think that intuitively we all got that. But it's always important to remember not to underwrite your major scenes. So for stories in general, these are the story beats. And what's going to follow is I'm going to talk about story beats for romance, story beats for mystery, and story beats for spec fic fantasy. So these are and you're going to notice all of them are basically, there's about 13 of them. Generally, these are your scenes that we're going to lay out along that kind of framework of your three-story arc. The opening scene, the inciting incident, which is also called the call to action. Generally, close upon the call is what we call the refusal of the challenge or the refusal of the call. Then, eventually, the characters accept the challenge and the story goes forward. Now, this is color coded here. The blues are Act 1, the greens are Act 2, and the purples are Act 3. I was actually giving a different talk where I was color coding everything, so this is from the color coding. In the middle, where stuff happens, even though there's only 3 little lines, the trials, obstacles, and conflicts, that's the guts of that entire middle of the book. If you're writing a romance, that's where all of the intimacy increases and the desire and arousal increase and the emotional connection increases. If you're writing a mystery, that's where all the clues happen. That's where you up the ante. That's where more of the challenges and dangers ensue in your sci-fi fantasies. The point of no return is generally the middle of the book. It's generally a big scene at the 50% mark. The crisis or the black moment occurs towards the end of the middle of the book, usually at the opening of the last part of the book, at the last 25% mark. The epiphany is where your character finally figures things out. They either figure themselves out, they figure out the mystery, they figure out why they haven't been able to overcome the whatever challenge may be presented by the enemy, the alien, the supernatural force, and they finally conquer that, whatever it may be, in the resolution, and we end up with a satisfying ending where the character is changed, the goal is achieved, the world is saved, or the ending is a happy one. And we're going to look at how that works going forward. So these are the romance beats. They're a little bit more specific, but they follow the same pattern. Again, we're color coded, and we're going to go through these in a little bit more detail later, but I wanted to kind of set this up for you. So in the first 25% of the book, in the first act, the romance beats that are going to fall, and these are pretty straightforward, obviously. You're going to introduce your main characters. You will hint at the conflict, particularly, it depends on how you create your romance. If both of your characters are going to have a story arc, meaning you're going to really concentrate on what changes for both characters, or if you're only going to concentrate on one character, you'll be hinting at the conflict to intimacy and a romantic connection early on in the book. The first meeting occurs in the first 25%. There's argument as to when the first meeting should occur, particularly in some of the mainstream commercial romance lines. The editors will dictate that you have to meet in the first chapter. My characters often don't meet in the first chapter, but they need to meet pretty quickly. I mean, a romance is about the interaction between two characters. It is not about one character's personal journey in and of itself. It's the story of that character's journey in connection to another human being. That's what makes it a romance. There are lots of books that will deal with a character's personal journey, and they may actually have a love story in there somewhere too. But if it isn't totally integrated, if it's not about their emotional journey, it's not a romance. So the first meeting will occur fairly early in a romance. Obviously, there needs to be an attraction. The attraction may not be welcome, frequently isn't. It may be acknowledged as attraction, but it's not what the characters want. That's pretty significant. That's a key element in a romance. If they meet and they're attracted and they want to be attracted and everything's cool, that's great too, but now you don't have a romance story. So initially there will be resistance. That doesn't mean necessarily that they don't like each other. They may like each other very much, but they have a reason that one or both have a reason that they don't want to be intimately connected. That's the resistance to attraction. And you can go anywhere in the universe with that in terms of how you build that. And that resistance to attraction will be based on what the conflict is for the character. Ultimately, though, at the end of the first arc, at the end of Act 1, these characters need to be allied in some way. They need to be in contact with one another, or you're going to have a hard time writing a romance. Sometimes tropes will help you determine how you keep them together. And a really simple example is if you're writing an office romance, or two people have to work together, they're going to have to see each other. And if they have a common goal, they're actually going to have to work together. So they may not like each other, or they may not want to be around each other, but they're going to have to be. So that's one way. If you have two characters who are somehow involved with raising the same child, then they're going to have to be around each other, or working with the same child for whatever reason. Marriages of convenience, that's a great trope where obviously the two characters have to be together and they have to even pretend they like each other. So tropes can sometimes help you, especially at this point when you get ready to basically say they accept the challenge, meaning they're going to have to spend time together and go forward. In the middle scene or the middle act of the romance, you're going to have all of the scenes that show the progression of emotional attraction, the increasing physical intimacy, the increasing emotional intimacy. You will frequently see the first kiss, or if you're writing a sweet, or the first love scene. If you're writing a sweet romance, you may not have a graphic love scene in the second act. You may not have one at all, but it may be pushed off. It depends on how you're developing your scenes. At some point towards the end of the story, there has to be a major challenge that will allow the characters to make that final leap of growth. In a romance, very briefly, what that means is your character started out the story with one belief, which they have told themselves and made them and lived with and allowed them to be good, productive human beings, because it helped them deal with something that was very hurtful to them in the past. In a simple example would be someone who fears abandonment. Say that this character's a parent died, the other parent abandoned them. So they have the fear that if they become intimately related with someone, that will happen again. So they resist intimate connections. And they're good with that. And they tell themselves they're fine. You know, they're very successful in their work. They have casual relationships. They have friends. They don't need a person. That's the disbelief that they live with to protect themselves so that they're not wounded again. As they break down these barriers and as they become more intimate and more physically involved and fall in love, that fear starts to come back. And they reach a breaking point where they basically say, I can't do this. This is going to lead to disaster. I need to get out of this. And you will see at this point an emotional separation between the characters. This is the impetus for them to reevaluate their lives, to think about what they really want, what they've done, what they want, what they need. That's the epiphany. Those are a series of scenes where the character begins to realize that what they thought was true about themselves and what they made themselves believe is not really what they want anymore. They have come to a new place and they see themselves more clearly. This is your character arc. This is the arc of growth. And this allows them to open themselves to the reality of love as something that is well worth the risk of taking. And that's the character arc. And that's a really quick condensation of a really big topic. But that's what happens during the epiphany in a romance. And you will then have your declaration of love and your promise of commitment at the end of the romance. And in today's world, that may be what we call an HEA, which is happily ever after, or happy for now, meaning you leave the reader with the belief that these characters are committed to this relationship and exploring a future together. There's a little bit of a difference there. And so that's kind of, those are the romance beats. Mystery beats are very, very much the same. They're not the same scenes, but the same sort of process follows through. And if you're writing a romantic intrigue, you can actually use these to help you build the subplot of romantic intrigue too. Early on in the first act, you're going to want to present the crime or the victim. So that's the setup. the sleuth, the suspects who may be involved, or the villains, the criminals, the dangerous people, the complications that the crime may present to the sleuth if there's a personal conflict, and whatever personal subplot there may be. So obviously, if you're writing a romantic intrigue, that's going to be built in there. They're going to be meeting the other character. During the second act, the big part of the mystery is where the investigation will proceed, where more clues will be revealed, more suspects will be revealed. You will actually show the sleuth, whoever it happens to be, whether it's your private eye, whether it's a cop, whether it's the amateur detective, they will be detecting, because that's what the story is all about. And suspects will be interviewed and narrowed down, and the sleuth will think they are starting to hone in on who the guilty party might be or how to solve this crime. But as this scene progresses, more elements of danger are injected. Maybe there's another crime. Maybe there's a threat against the primary detective. So even though we're starting to expose more about the mystery or the threat or the person that's stalking the main character, more events have to happen to increase the tension and increase the stakes, until ultimately, when you reach the third scene, you're kind of at a breaking point. And very often, this is where we start to see more revealed about the inner life of the villain. The sleuth, detective, cop may come to a conclusion which is often early on not the right one. They think they have the right one, but it turns out they don't. And this is where you will very often see a review of the clues, a reworking of what's come before. New information may be introduced so that in the third act, you can resolve the crime, catch the bad guy, stop the bomber, whatever you're writing, so that in the end, you can have a safe world, justice is served. So these follow exactly the same patterns that you would see in a romance arc, or that you would see in any story, primary story beats. But these are more specific if you're writing a mystery or a crime or a procedural or a romance that has these elements. If you're kind of stuck where to go, you can think about introducing some of these elements into your plot as you go forward. Same is true if you're writing sci-fi fantasy. This is a little bit skewed towards sci-fi, but it's certainly the same element if you're writing fantasy. And that's, number one is the setting. You have to establish the world, and you're going to do a little bit more work up front when you're writing sci-fi fantasy, because you have to establish the world right away. It can be really confusing if the reader doesn't know where they are or when they are or what the rules are or what the inhabitants are like. You will introduce your heroes. And again, these are very often quest stories where the hero is basically needs to save the world. They lend themselves extraordinarily well to quests and to basically overcoming a threat to the world. The hero commits and moves on, and in the center part, the middle 50% of your book is where, again, all the cool stuff happens, where there's battles, where there's monsters, where the hero sometimes is vanquished and doesn't win all the fights, but obviously begins to accrue allies, may acquire new powers, more information about the world may be exposed, so that ultimately, even though it appears that they're not going to win, they will finally either recommit to the battle, discover a new weapon, find new information, or bring in new allies that will help them in the final battle to save the world or overcome the zombie apocalypse or save, their pack from outside interference, whatever it may be. Again, major story points, very similar. So when you get ready, in way of review, to write your scene, now that we've kind of talked about all of these things, you can ask yourself, what's the purpose? How is it going to advance the plot and reveal character? And one good way to do this is to ask yourself, where did I leave my characters? What will they do or think or feel next? Whose point of view am I going to write it in? Whose ownership will buy the most impact in this scene? And another way to think about that is, who's going to be most moved by, changed by this scene, or who drives the action? What kind of a scene is it? Is this going to be a big scene where I'm going to introduce a new plot element? Is it going to be a scene where I'm going to show my character being changed by what happens? Or am I going to write a scene that's going to set up one of those big scenes going forward? Is there action in the scene? And if there is it increasing the conflict? Is it doing something besides just moving parts around? And we're going to talk about action scenes in just a second. What's the emotional impact on the characters? And what's the climax of the scene? Where does it end? Does it end with a decision? Does it end with a cliffhanger? Does it end with the main character in danger? So this is basically those three parts of your scene: beginning, middle, and end. These are the questions to ask that will help you formulate what that scene's going to look like. So I'm going to talk about 2 or 3 different kinds of scenes and what you want to accomplish in those scenes. The first is the opening scene. And now we know about all of these things. This is the opening scene in your book, and it may be the opening chapter, which is fine. You're going to define your setting, establish your narrative voice. Is it first, second, third? You may be setting the mood with the language that you use, the descriptions that you use, or the way your characters think or talk. You're going to introduce your main characters. You're going to show them at some point pretty early on in the book their normal life. What's their day like? What's their life like? What do they think is going to be the next 50 years of their life? And then you're going to hint at maybe there's something that makes that normal life a little bit difficult, a little bit problematic. Try to avoid backstory as much as possible. I don't think it's completely possible to avoid backstory ever, because we are our past. Everything that we've experienced makes us who we are today. We don't start out a blank canvas every morning, and neither do our characters. So I think it's a little fallacious and a little simplistic to say no backstory, but it's got to be very minimal. You need to keep it short. Maybe just thread in a thought here or there, the kinds of things you think about during the day that come from your previous experience. You will introduce the inciting incident. That is the first turning point in your story. That's where your character starts their journey. Something happens. And then that something, hopefully, will hook your reader into wanting to go forward. Either the thing that happens is interesting enough that they want to know more, or it presents the character with a question or a problem, or leaves the reader with a question about what is the character going to do, what's going to happen to her. So that's the hook. There's something of interest that you have alluded to or hinted at that will keep the reader going. And it may be something just as simple as a relatable issue, the baby at the door, whatever it is that all of us can relate to, because if it were to happen, we would be hooked into it. When you write your action scenes, okay, these are very specific scenes, and we are talking about action, meaning stuff is moving around. Make sure that the scene has a purpose within your story, that it's not just an interesting fight scene because you need one. I mean, I used to joke that, when I didn't know what to do in my romantic intrigues, I would just have someone get shot It certainly is a way to amp up the tension, but it has to also be integral to the story. There has to be a reason for it. There has to be a reason for every scene. So you're in your action scene, you're going to want to do something that helps build character, or that creates connections between the characters, or that produces a result that advances the story. If you're writing it can be physical hand-to-hand combat, can be weapons, can be a space battle, it may be a natural disaster. All of these things relate to action scenes. Make sure you research your weapons. If you're using guns, if you're flying airplanes, if you're using helicopters in your scenes, if you're using vehicles, or if you have a volcano erupting. Authenticity is really important in action scenes. So is setting up the action. Very few things just pop up out of nowhere. Now, there can be a surprise attack anywhere in any of your books. Sneak attacks, assassinations, all of a sudden the alien spaceship is uncloaked and there's an attack. But very often in your procedurals, for example, you may show the characters preparing for battle, and that helps increase suspense. So depending on what it is you want to accomplish, you can decide if you're going to set the stage for this action scene or if it's going to emerge out of nowhere. In terms of writing, technical details, keep your sentences short, keep your verbs active. Dialogue is great, description is not. No one stops in the middle of a battle to smell the flowers or to notice that somebody looks hot. They may have thought she looked hot before the battle, but they're not going to be thinking about it while somebody's shooting at them. So you're going to want to keep the shorter your sentences, the more dynamic your verbs, the greater the sense of suspense and movement for your reader. Try to engage all of the senses during the action scenes. And I just showed a couple of examples here. Heart thudding, coppery tang of blood, acid bite of cordite, sweat prickling on the neck, a whirlwind of screams. These are sensations, taste, sound, smell. You want to try to hit them all as they would be experienced by the character, not described, but how their body responds to and incorporates these senses. And as I said, avoid your introspection or reflection. If you're writing hand-to-hand combat, it would be really good if you have some experience with it. If you're a martial artist, that helps. If you're not, I think a great way to do it is to read scenes written by people who write good action scenes so that you can get a sense of how they move and how they flow. I think that's it for that one. Okay. This is a very short scene of mine that I wrote. This is it. This is the whole scene. And it does start out slowly. So I'm just going to use this as an example. It shows dialogue being interspersed with some action, a little bit of description early on. Grady slowed further, eyeing the swaying swing. The breeze was faint, not enough to provoke that much motion, but the swing was empty. The shadows on the porch were alive, though, shifting pools of inky black, melting and reforming the closer Grady approached. As she trod cautiously up the walk, the shadows coalesced into the shape of a man outside the front window, his arm reaching toward the front door latch. "Hey!" Grady bounded up the steps. "What are you—" Pain shot through her face. Her feet flew out from under her. She sailed backward, landing with a teeth-jarring thud on the front stairs. The porch light flicked on, and Taylor's voice cut through the fog in Grady's pain-addled brain. "Who's out there?" Taylor called. Somehow, Grady got her legs to work and staggered upright. Billy Riley grabbed Taylor's arm and tried to shove inside the house with her. "Hold it!" Grady lowered her shoulder and rushed Billy. He was 6 inches taller and probably 100 pounds heavier, but she hit him at an angle just above the hips. She used every bit of power in her thighs and her center mass to plow into his soft flank. The blow knocked him off balance. As he stumbled away, he crashed into the railing and tumbled over into the yard, along with a good portion of the spindles and rails. "Get in the house and call the police," Grady yelled. So that's it for my action scene, my fight scene anyways. So I tried to set it up with a sense of quiet and foreboding, and then a quick burst of action there, and then a little end of dialogue. So then it incorporates a little bit of all those elements. Moving on to the notorious sex scene. The question is, when do you write a sex scene? Do you have to write a sex scene? The answer is nope. You don't have to write a sex scene any more than you have to write any other scene. And if you do write a sex scene, it has all of the same requirements and functions as every other scene. So writing sex scenes will provide a lot of information about characters. It shows the progression of intimacy, which is important in the romance arc. It reveals something about your character, when they have sex, where they have sex, how they have sex, who they have sex with. All of those things can tell you something about a character. If you're writing a book in which the character has sex with a stranger at the beginning of the book because they don't want an intimate relationship with anyone else, it tells you something about character. So sex scenes have exactly the same function and form, essentially, as any other scene. If you're writing a romance, for example, usually your graphic sex scenes will be at the later end of the book, because it takes you a while, or it takes me a while at any rate, to create the intimacy and connection and believability between the characters for them to have sex. If you're writing an erotic romance, there's going to be a lot more sex. It'll usually happen a lot earlier. In an erotic romance, the sex scenes are central to the characters' relationship growth and their character arc, which is what distinguishes them from a romance with lots of sex. When should you not write a sex scene? Well, the most important answer to that is when it doesn't say anything about the character or the story. But almost as important is when it's out of character. If a sex scene appears to come out of nowhere, if there's no foundation for the characters to be having sex, if there's no reason for them to be having sex, meaning that their relationship hasn't progressed to the point where they are connected enough to want sex, or trusting enough to want sex, or turned on enough, or attracted enough, or whatever the reason may be, then the sex scene is out of character for one of those, and it won't feel authentic. It will feel tacked on or stuck in, and that's the time to get rid of it. This is when it's only sex, which basically doesn't mean, oh, the characters aren't in love, so they shouldn't have sex. No, it means that it's occurring out of context to the story. It doesn't add anything to the story, anything new. It doesn't close a story point for one of the characters. Say they were previously very untrusting or not sure that they wanted to be touched, but now they do. Those are the kinds of things that within a sex scene you can show character change. But if it doesn't do anything in terms of telling us more about character or adding something new to the plot line, it's only sex, and it's not going to work. And the last is what I call bad timing, which basically means, again, for that particular story or that particular pair of characters, it doesn't make sense. If they're in the midst of a car chase, they're probably not going to pull in off somewhere to have sex. Or, I mean, literally, if they're in a battle and the battle is not over, the danger is imminent again, then there may not be time. On the other hand, a crisis will perpetuate a heightened sense of the need to reinforce their own kind of life force, their own vitality, and the adrenaline surge and the hormone surge. When the battle is over, they may very well want to have sex if you can find the time. But if it doesn't seem like it's reasonable at that point, then the timing is not good. Your readers will say, oh yeah, right, nobody's gonna have sex then. So again, it always has to be believable wherever you put it in the story. In terms of writing the scene itself, dialogue, you want to make sure that you set the stage. Now, there may be very little foreplay, or there may not be a lot of seduction, But if you are writing a slow sex scene where the characters are kind of toying with each other, dialogue is important. Touch is always important. It's not just what the characters do to each other, it's how they feel as they're being touched, or how they feel touching someone else. So how they think and how they feel during the sex scene is really important. Be sure that you maintain the same kind of language and thoughts for the character, including in their dialogue, that you've created through the whole book. If you're writing a sweet romance, when the characters have love or make love, they're probably not suddenly going to be using very graphic language to describe each other or themselves or in dialogue. So you want to keep those two things together. On the other hand, if you're writing a gritty, kind of like very graphic, erotic romance where there's a lot of screwing going on, then they're going to use different language, and it would seem odd if they didn't. So again, you need to keep things organically connected. And that's true, especially in a love scene. Be aware of the physicality. You don't need a lot of stage direction. I think that moving arms and legs and hands around should be kept to a minimum. It's about what they feel as they make love, and sometimes what they think, much more than what they do. And as I said previously, the timing is really important. It needs to fit the story. I'm going to go quickly through a couple of more things so we can get to some of these questions. Prologue or not to prologue? I'm not opposed to prologues. I think that you can use a prologue, especially if you're writing a romantic intrigue, to introduce your villain. You can also show a past interaction between the main characters if it has bearing on your present story. So if you're writing a reunion romance, then you may very well have a prologue that shows them earlier in time. Do not put backstory in your prologue. That's not what it's for. It's not where your world building should be. And if it's an action scene, that usually it won't work for the reader because they don't know the characters. Now, you can pull it off, but in general, if it's something that happens before the story starts, but it has your characters in it, then start the story there so that you can give the reader more of a sense of your characters. Epilogue, same thing. There's a great desire for stories with characters we love never to end. But in fact, you're gonna want the story to end when the tension breaks, when the sexual conflict is over, when in a romance the characters say, I love you. You need to tie it up. You need to show them affirming their relationship, but you're really not gonna wanna show them at Thanksgiving dinner. There are some exceptions to that. In some particular genres, Regencies, for example, epilogues are practically universal. If you have loose ends that you need to tie up, if time has passed and you want to show a glimpse of the future, then an epilogue, you can do that. If you're setting up another book in a series and you want to show a new villain or another character in danger, an epilogue is a good place to do that. But in general, you don't want an epilogue to be on a downswing. You don't want the book to end with a lack of conflict and tension. All right, we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm gonna skip a little bit of what I was gonna do here and just take you through these scenes that we've already talked about and kind of show you what this looks like at the end so that I can get to the questions. And I think that we've pretty much covered how we're going to put our scenes together to make this work. And I'm going to show you basically the final, what this looks like at the end. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you put all those scenes together. This is kind of like the payoff slide. So these are our key scenes that we've talked about. And now we know how to write them. We know how to start them. We know what to put in them. These are the kinds of the things that we're going to put in these scenes as we create this story. So first act is where we're going to do our setting. It's where we're going to put our main characters. It's going to be where we show our conflict and then the characters getting together. In the middle, that's where our stuff happens. And if we're writing a romance, that's where the intimacy and the physical connection and the psychological, emotional connections begin. If we're writing mysteries and sci-fi, there's a lot of action happening here. And then at the end is where we're going to get to show our change in our characters, solve the crime, defeat the enemy, and basically save the world or have our happy ending. And I think that as we've gone through the various scenes and where they fall, hopefully you will be able to have a sense of each scene, how to start it, what to put in it, and how to move the reader through the story scene after scene. For those of you who are writing romances, basically I've kind of reworked that same picture because I know a lot of you are, but these are the romance beats that are put in here, and it just shows you basically exactly what we've talked about going through before. The meat of the characters, the resistance to their attraction, working together, all of the increase in intimacy, and finally, the rejection of their fears, the embrace of their true self, and the declaration of love. These are the references that we used. These are the excerpts from the books that I quoted. And if you're interested in any of these, I'll be happy to give them to you. And I am going to go right to the Q&A right now. All right, I'm going to try it. I'm just going to start at the top and go through, and I'll skip any that look like they're redundant. And I think we can probably get through them. I want to thank you for your attention if we run right up to the wire. Can you slow the pace or action by writing longer scenes? It depends on what the scene is that you're writing. If it's an action scene, even if it's longer, the pace may still be fast. I'm not sure why you would want to slow the pace. If you think that you're going too fast, it's probably because you are missing scenes. Not that your scenes are too short, but that you're missing in between scenes. So if you're looking and you say, wow, I've only got 40,000 words and my story's done, chances are good you're missing your reflection scenes or your reaction scenes. Okay, in deep point of view in the story overall, oops, where'd it go? What role does the narrator play versus okay, well, your point of view character should be your narrator in almost every case. There are cases in books where the narrator and the point of view character are different, but that's very unusual in genre fiction. So basically, in first point of view, yes, the narrator is the character. In third, no. In third person, your point of view character is still the narrator. You don't have an offstage narrator ordinarily. If you're writing omniscient, then, and most people aren't, and most of the time you aren't, omniscient means a narrator who knows everything about everyone. Again, generally, you are not writing an omniscient narrator. So your narrator in third person is the narrator. Your character in third is the narrator. I hope that's clear. If not, shoot me an email. If you establish the point of view time place within the first sentence or two, how do you prevent each scene or paragraph from sounding, oh, okay, oh, well, okay. If your setting is the same in every scene, that's not very likely. So every time your character moves to a new place or a new time, they're probably going to be in a different situation. And again, if you only have one point of view character, then you don't have to worry very much about establishing point of view because the readers know it's always them. But they're going to be in a different time and place. So you would start like when Sally got to the restaurant at noon the next day. All right, well, that's only one scene. That sets the time and place and who it is. But she's not going to start every day or every scene going to the same place. So you're not going to, it won't be repetitive, depending on what you're doing. Again, hope that answers that. Are the slides available somewhere? No, but if you, this talk is recorded, so you'll be able to go back and review, because I know that there's a lot of information in here. In discussing beginning your novel, you discuss using both narrative launch and action launch to establish point of view. Using narrative launch, is it acceptable to start with a point of view from the past, using an event 20 years prior? Well, then if you're going to use an event 20 years prior, then it's either going to be a flashback, a memory, or a prologue. I think it's fine to do that. I would not open a book with a lot of reminiscing, like somebody sitting around thinking about their past, because it's not very dynamic and it's not really catchy. If you think there's something that happened 20 years past that's critical to establishing the beginning of the story, then you might consider a prologue. But basically, you want to start the story in the here and now, very close to the point where the character is going to start off in the new direction. How do you decide when to switch point of view? You switch point of view when you want to show something important happening to the other character. You want to show their thoughts, their feelings, their reactions. If one of the characters is going to do something that's going to advance the plot, they should have the point of view. So if you're writing a reflection scene after a first kiss, and you have a character that's going to be impacted by that kiss in such a way that it's going to change the plot, you want to be in their point of view so that you can show their response to it. So the character who will move the plot forward should have the point of view. That's what I mean by they drive the scene. If you have a character who is committed to doing something, you know, you've got a character that you've shown is the one that's going to be pushing for more intimacy, then the first kiss is probably going to come from their point of view. But again, if it's more important to show the other character who's being kissed, then use their point of view. So you have to decide who's going to move the story forward the most. How do you decide how much time has passed between scenes? Well, it depends on the story and how quickly you're going to move it along. In a romantic intrigue or an action story or a mystery, you're going to have short time span for the entire story, because usually a crime is solved in just a few days. Or if you've got a villain who's chasing after someone or threatening your main character, you're going to have shorter time frames. If you're writing a romance that you want to spend a summer developing, then basically you're going to have to build in that time. And you can certainly do it by saying, you know, she was so busy for the last week that she never had a chance to call. Or the emergency room was so full that 3 days passed before she had a chance to check her messages. You build in your time by basically little snippets like that. It doesn't have to be a big deal, but it allows you to show time passing. I try to be as vague as I can with time, because if you're not, your readers are gonna be emailing you that your timeline is off. And my timeline is always off, and it makes my editors totally nuts. So I try to be really vague about time. So again, time passes depending on how quickly you want your story to move. How many scenes do you write a day? It depends. I may write a full chapter. I may write 2 scenes. I write about 6,000 to 7,000 words a week. So again, my scenes vary. How would you decide when it is time for a new chapter? My chapters are always beats to a certain extent, meaning that if I have had a major beat in chapter X, then the next chapter is going to be partially a response to that chapter, and then something that moves things a little bit forward. When you have written the moment, the purpose of that scene, if it is to introduce a new character, introduce a new threat, have an intimate moment, reveal a clue, whatever it is. When you start and you say, this is what I want to do in this scene, this is what I want to show in this scene, as soon as you're done with that, if there's nothing else that's relevant to that point, it's done. It may be a one scene chapter. For example, when I write an opening chapter, I introduce both new characters. I write one scene with the one character and the second scene with the other character, and they haven't met yet. And then when that's done, chapter one is done, and I bring them together. So whether it's a single scene in a chapter or an entire chapter, when you've accomplished what you've decided you're going to introduce into your story, it's done. It doesn't matter how long it is. If you have two major characters in the scene that are each experiencing growth, etc., how do you divide the scene to balance both characters and their growth? It depends on how you like to handle point of view. And that's a whole other, talk. But the simplest way, and what most people would suggest that beginning writers in particular use, is a scene break. So that the first part of the scene is one character in their point of view, and you break the scene and move to the other character's point of view. That's a very traditional standard way to do it. In the romance beats, can you delve a little more into the shared goal, conflicting motivation? Yes. Basically, the two characters have to work together, even though they might have a different goal. So say that somehow the two characters are given joint custody of a child, an orphan, and maybe it's related to one of them or not. And they both see a different future for that child. So they have to work together, but the outcome they want is at odds. Or they both need to save a farm, but one of them wants to save it because she's an organic farmer, and the other one wants to save it because they want to look for shale oil underneath. I think I wrote that book myself. So they are forced to be together, but they don't want the same thing initially.
Radclyffe, that is, we are exactly at time. So
okay,
you got to a lot of questions. And I will tell anyone that had questions that didn't get answered, subscribe to Bold Stroke Books newsletter so you can get notified when Radclyffe is doing another online class.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate it.
That was amazing. So good.